Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. Ukraine War News Update, third part thereof for the 24th of May 2024. This is a geopolitical video concerning the war in Ukraine, as in geopolitical news. Let's go to the very first exceedingly important piece, which is that an exclusive from Reuters claims Putin wants a Ukraine ceasefire on current front lines. Okay, let's just give you the summary points. I'll give you my tuppence and then we go through it. Right, Russian sources indicate Putin is ready to halt the conflict at the front. Putin is to take more land to pressure Kiev to talk, according to sources. Does not want another national mobilization, according to sources. Putin has no designs on NATO territory, those same sources. And Russia is concerned about a nuclear escalation, again, according to sources. So, first thing to note is that if Putin wants a ceasefire, it is for the benefit of one person and one person only, Putin. So there is absolutely no reason for him to ask for or seek or intend to have a ceasefire unless it's massively to the benefit of Russia and to the detriment of Ukraine. You could therefore also argue, and I think this might have some merit, that this is at a time where Putin might be realizing that Ukraine are just about to have a pretty significant effect on Russia on the battlefield. So what we've seen for the last couple of weeks, we have seen Ukraine completely degrade the Russian air defense capability ahead of F-16s coming online. We have seen Crimea and Novorossiysk and Sevastopol get absolutely hammered. And we have seen refineries get hammered to the point where 14% of the oil refining capacity has been taken out. We are then looking forward to, well, if the air defences have been degraded now, then you aren't replacing the S-400 battery that just got lost 2 days ago. You're not replacing the S-400 battery that got lost in Jankoy. You're not replacing the S-400 or 300 battery taken out in Belbek. Or, we've got three of those huge multi-million dollar, maybe $1 billion worth of battery. You can't replace that. And so therefore that degradation means that Russia is increasingly weak in terms of being able to respond to drone and missile attacks. And if Ukraine have a lot of ATACMS at their fingertips, and if they are producing drones at the rates that they are claiming, and evidently at significant rates, since we had 2 nights of 100 drones within 3 nights in this last week, then Russia are looking at a very difficult next few months. And they probably know that. And I've said plenty of times that the only way Russia can do anything significant now is with a national mobilization and or huge help from China. Now, in the absence of huge help from China, like meaningful quantities of lethal aid expedited sort of now, Russia are in a lot of trouble. Ukraine are on their knees, but they are mobilizing and they've got a lot of aid coming their way. A lot of aid that was already sort of in the pipelines, like F-16s and like refurbished tanks and whatnot, that are now coming to fruition, plus the extra aid packages that are coming in consistently from all these different places, including, and very importantly, from the US. Together with that mobilization and with the F-16s coming online, the Ukraine are arguably in a much better position going forward. This is why I said all along in this war that you've got this degradation of the Russian forces and an improvement in the Ukrainian equipment. So degradation of Russian equipment, improvement of Ukrainian equipment has been going like this for 2 years, right? The issue being mobilization, right, for both sides, but actually Ukraine, that's a real issue too. But that aside, they need to mobilize, but the Ukrainians are mobilizing. Russians need to do a national mobilization, and this article and the sources indicate that he doesn't want to do a national mobilization, which is pretty obvious because he would have already done it. Like if it wasn't fraught with issue, if it wasn't going to absolutely economically hamstring the Russians, then Putin would have called for a national mobilization. Of course he would, but he knows that will sound the economic death knell for Russia, and his popularity would plummet. So he's in a really difficult position Even though there's a lot of dooming about Ukraine at the moment, I'm of the opinion that actually Ukraine, for the next couple of months, if they just sit back and soak up the Russian pressure, can absolutely cripple Russia with distance munitions. That's what I keep saying, and I still feel strongly about that. And I think that's why you're seeing Putin go, ceasefire. And although this is coming from sources, so it says Russian President Vladimir Putin is ready to halt the war in Ukraine with a negotiated ceasefire that recognises the current battlefield lines. Four Russian sources told Reuters, saying he's prepared to fight in Kiev if Kiev and the West do not respond. Three of the sources familiar with discussions in Putin's entourage said the veteran Russian leader had expressed frustration to a small group of advisors about what he views as Western-backed attempts to stymie negotiations and Ukrainian President Zelensky's decision to rule out talks. Okay, so my opinion here is that this isn't about advisors leaking this to the press. This is coming from Putin. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that this is very much a way of sounding out, of getting this information out there, of Putin sanctioning a message to the West. And he could do that just secretly on the direct telephone line to the US, but of course he wants this to grab the public, so the public go, oh look, there's peace, and put pressure. There needs to be public. He would like public pressure on Ukraine to go to the negotiating table. But of course it's to his benefit, and he is also saying, it's the West and it's Zelensky that are ruling out talks. They're the ones that haven't wanted talks, and that's of course complete nonsense, because it is Putin that has been not wanting to negotiate. Now, you could argue both of them. Quote, Putin can fight for as long as it takes, but Putin is also ready for a ceasefire to freeze the war, said another of the four, a senior Russian source who has worked with Putin and has knowledge of top-level conversations in the Kremlin. Okay, all a bit vague. He, like the others cited in this story, spoke on the condition of anonymity given the matter's sensitivity. For this account, Reuters spoke to a total of 5 people who work with or have worked with Putin at a senior level in the political and business worlds. The 5th source did not comment on freezing the war at the current front lines. So on and so forth. So I think this is very much a case of this being in Russia's best interests, and this is him sounding out and trying to put public pressure on Ukraine to go to the negotiating table. And I would advise against that at the moment, because it would be so beneficial to Russia. 3 sources said Putin understood any dramatic new advances would require another nationwide mobilization, which he didn't want, with one source who knows the Russian president saying his popularity dipped after the first mobilization in September 2022. And that's nothing to disagree with that. So in response to questions for this story, a US State Department spokesman said any initiative for peace must respect Ukraine's territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. So that's 1991, right? And described Russia as the sole obstacle to peace in Ukraine. Quote, the Kremlin has yet to demonstrate any meaningful interest in ending this war. Quite the opposite. And that's the point, is that while he blames Zelensky in the West for there not being peace negotiations, it is Putin, it's at his feet that the responsibility for that lies. In the past, Kiev has dismissed Russia's purported readiness to talk as an attempt to shift the blame onto it for the war. Kiev says Putin, whose team repeatedly denied he was planning a war before invading Ukraine in 2022, cannot be trusted to honour any deal. Both Russia and Ukraine have said they fear the other side would use any ceasefire to rearm. And talking about territory here, it says Putin's insistence on locking in any battlefield gains in a deal is non-negotiable, all the sources suggested. Putin would, however, be ready to settle for what land he has now and freeze the conflict at the current front lines, 4 of the sources said. Quote, Putin will say that we won, that NATO attacked us and we kept our sovereignty, that we have a land corridor to Crimea, which is true, one of them said, giving their own analysis. Freezing the conflict along current lines would leave Russia in possession of substantial chunks of 4 Ukrainian regions he formally incorporated into Russia in September 22, but without full control of any of them. Such an arrangement would fall short of the goals Moscow set for itself at the time, when it said the 4 of the Ukraine's regions, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson, now belong to it in their entirety. Dmitry Peskov, the spokesman for the Kremlin, said that there could be no question of handing back the 4 regions, which were now permanently part of Russia according to its constitution. Oh, that's fine then. You've written in your constitution, that's fine. It can't be changed. It's just written in stone. Another factor playing into the Kremlin's chief's view that the war should end is that the longer it drags on, the more battle-hardened veterans return to Russia, dissatisfied with post-war job and income prospects, potentially creating tensions in society, said one of the sources who has worked with Putin. I would say that is definitely a concern for the Russians. That kind of social cohesion of returning veterans is certainly an issue. In the absence of a ceasefire, Putin wants to take as much territory as possible to ratchet up pressure on Ukraine while seeking to exploit unexpected opportunities to acquire more, 3 of the sources said. Russian forces control about 18% of Ukraine and this month thrust into the northeastern region of Kharkiv. Putin is counting on Russia's large population compared to Ukraine to sustain superior manpower even without a mobilization bolstered by unusually generous pay packets for those who sign up. Quote, Russia will push further, the source who has worked with Putin said. Putin will slowly conquer territories until Zelensky comes up with an offer to stop, the person said, saying the Russian leader had expressed a view to aides that the West would not provide enough weapons, sapping Ukraine's morale. US and European leaders have said they will stand by Ukraine until its sovereignty is guaranteed. NATO countries and allies say they're trying to accelerate deliveries of weapons. Quote, Russia could end this war at any time by withdrawing its forces from Ukraine instead of continuing to launch brutal attacks against Ukrainian cities, ports and people every day, the State Department said in response to a question about weapons supplies. And absolutely right there. All 5 sources said Putin had told advisors he has no designs on NATO territory, reflecting his public comments on the matter. 2 of the sources cited Russian concerns about a growing danger of escalation with the West, including nuclear escalation over the Ukraine standoff. It's just, this is, as far as I'm concerned, a non-starter for Ukraine. It is basically Russia trying this one on, knowing that if Ukraine had agreed to negotiations now, Russia would, I wouldn't go so far as to say Russia would win here, because as mentioned in the article, it's far short of what they set out as their objectives. So they would have failed in their objectives, but they would win in as much as they would disallow Ukraine's own victory here. So Ukraine would need to get at least back to 2014 I think territory to call this a draw. Otherwise, they're kind of lost, or they're losing net territory. But ideally, they want to get back to 1991 borders and get Crimea and the Donbass, or certainly Crimea. I think if Ukraine came out with Crimea and then Zaporizhia and Kherson back, they would be like, yeah, happy days. That's a victory. I think anything else that is kind of a draw that is really not good enough for Ukraine. But since I support Ukraine, you don't want to draw. You don't want to score draw. You don't want anything that's not the optimal for Ukraine. And essentially, don't do it, Ukraine. Unable to visit anywhere in the free world due to being genocidal maniac, says Jay in Kiev about Putin. Putin announces another leg of his 2024 tour of hellish kleptocracies. From Belarus, Peskov announces Putin is going to North Korea in the near future. So another trip to North Korea. So he's just been to China, big delegation, going to North Korea. This guy needs weapons. So again, let's track that back to why is he asking for a ceasefire? So part of what it says in this article is that a ceasefire would be a chance for Russia to rearm, to reconstitute and rearm. This will definitely benefit Russia, especially since they're going around cap in hand to these different nations, to China, to North Korea, and I guess Iran. There was that Russian in the helicopter that perished with the Iranian helicopter crash. They need these weapons from these countries, and that shows, I think, what a precarious position Russia are in. And at the same time, a Russian opposition forum has been held in Lviv. So the forum brought together about 40 representatives of the Russian political opposition, representatives of the Ukrainian presidential office and parliament, and representatives of Russian volunteer battalions, units of the Russian Volunteer Corps, Freedom of Russia, Siberian Battalion, and others fighting on the side of Ukraine. Now it looks more and more like a coordination of efforts. Interesting. This is similar sort of things being done with Belarus. So Belarus has quite an active opposition that exists outside of Belarus. supported in the EU. This forum, though, was held with the assistance of the Ukrainian authorities. The event was planned and supervised by the relevant Ukrainian authorities and is part of a larger strategy towards the Russians. The event is also a clear informational signal to the outside world, to our Western partners. There are Russians who are ready to form an insurgent anti-Putin army and free the country from Putin's dictatorship to destroy the empire. There are political oppositionists who support this scenario, says Anton Gerashchenko. What was announced as a result of the forum? One, on the eve of the Global Peace Summit in Switzerland, which is coming up in a couple of weeks' time, the participants expressed support for Volodymyr Zelensky's peace formula. Two, the war against Ukraine is criminal and Putinism is illegitimate. The political regime of the Russian Federation must be changed, the war must be ended, and the occupied territories of Ukraine must be returned, and political prisoners and Ukrainian prisoners of war must be released. Three, supporting Russian volunteers and guerrilla groups fighting against the Putin regime should be a priority for the opposition. And four, turning the forums into a permanent platform for communication between the opposition, volunteers, and whatnot. So I think, interesting stuff and a positive development in providing a viable alternative to Putin, because of course there can be no political opposition set up inside Russia. You'll end up falling out of a window or in a gulag. So that's just never going to happen. So these things have to happen outside of Russia. Now, moving on. Japan has taken action against Russia for using weapons from North Korea in violation of UN rules. Why the UN hasn't done something, well, because Russia sit in the UN Security Council, but they have violated official resolutions and sanctions on North Korea, the Russians. So Japan has gone and sanctioned 2 companies in Cyprus as well as part of the investigation. So Japan seemed to be doing a good job there in holding Russia to account. It would be nice if the UN could. Estonia has summoned the Russian ambassador to explain why Russia dismantled buoys on the Narva River, which marked the border between the countries. I think they took around half of the buoys away because they are essentially trying to steal maritime territory. The Estonian Foreign Ministry said that the act was provocative and they will demand the immediate return of the buoys. And then the French aid to Ukraine reports that the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Europe, so the French Minister Stéphane Séjourné, has expressed his full solidarity with Estonia, Finland and Lithuania in the face of these unacceptable aggressive actions, so to do with the maritime territory that Russia have been looking to take. France will carefully monitor the situation alongside its allies. Russia has increased its provocations at the borders of the EU in Estonia, Finland and Lithuania, he says. So, hopefully some support for those nations. This is just rank aggressiveness, isn't it, from Russia? And, quote, those tensions came to a boil this week when Maximilian Krah, a senior AfD lawmaker, told an Italian newspaper that members of the Nazi SS were not necessarily criminals. So just to remind you that the AfD has entered a very troubling phase for itself, with its Maximilian Krah, the leader, stepping down, having nothing to do with the elections going forward, I think. Not going to turn up to rallies. All of these controversies involving both Russia and China, as well as rank kind of neo-Nazis and fascism, or at least not the denial thereof, has meant that Marine Le Pen's French National Rally have distanced themselves from them. AfD has been kicked out of the right wing, the further, not the centre right, but the proper far right wing of the European Parliament, a coalition thereof. Now, that's the preamble to this. So, Hungarian far right leader Lazio Torockai openly sides with the Russian infiltrated AfD. Moreover, he alleges that Poland's Confederacja, so that's a Confederacy party in Poland, or is it the Confederates? Anyway, the Confederate Party will also join their future group, which they have been organising for a long time. So this is slightly worrying here. There appears to be a new coalition group being set up within the EU Parliament of even further to the right than the far right group, right? So the European patriotic parties, scare quotes, which always want to correspond, according to this far right Hungarian parliamentarian or European parliamentarian, want to correspond to the enemy who is systematically destroying Europe, excluded the Alternative for Germany, AfD, party from the Identity and Democracy group of the European Parliament. Instead of closing in and protecting the leader of the AfD, Maximilian Krah, and a second, Peter Bystrom, who's also in a lot of controversy, against whom a brutal discrediting campaign is taking place, or maybe just, letting everyone know what he's really like and how many connections Bystrom has to Russia. Anyway, to continue, they rather suited the enemy and stabbed their former ally in the back. It's okay, it will be much better this way. Finally, and he mentions a whole load of different people like that the Polish party there, Thierry Baudet, loads of far-right people within Europe. We can create the new European faction that we have been organising for a long time, which can finally confront the globalists without compromise. We remember that AfD Lindemann also came out, so that's another German there, also came to the Hungarian-Serbian border to fight with us against migration. We don't forget, we stand by our allies and friends. We will not be traitors. We will not seek favours from the destroyers of Europe, as if it's like the others who are destroying Europe and not these people who are essentially trying to wreak havoc within Europe and disunite it, really, on the behest often of Russia. So yeah, that is something to look out for. But on the other hand, good news here is that we have an anti-Orban protest in Orban's birthplace. And don't ask me to say the name of that place, but I will try. Székesfehérvár. Anyway, good news to see this kind of activity. So really good to see a growing oppositional movement in Hungary to Viktor Orban and his Fidesz party that are so deeply ensconced in the Russian sphere of influence. Developments in Romania, where a man has been arrested for treason. He has been passing restricted photos, including NATO info, to the Russian embassy since 2022. Romania is a very important member of NATO at the moment, very close to Ukraine, is able to provide a big old F-16 training establishment. I think they've got a new base in the pipeline, a NATO base being built. So Romania has expelled a diplomat at Russia's embassy as a result. I'm sure there'll be a Russian retaliation to that. I've talked to you about how Poland is having an issue with Russian espionage and indeed sabotage. So it looks, Donald Tusk said that the Russians were likely behind the burning down of a mall the other day. Then they've arrested, was it 9 and then 3 more, so perhaps 12 people in connection with sabotage inquiries. Espionage inquiries. Bloomberg reports that Poland is tightening Ukraine's aid hub security over sabotage concerns. Quote, "We are facing a foreign state, so Russia, that is conducting hostile and kinetic action on Polish territory." And that's the Interior Minister, Tomasz Siemoniak. Poland is very much talking about how Russia are involved in, as they say, kinetic, like tangible activities on the territory of Poland. Poland, a NATO member. So, there are concerns that we're getting closer and closer to a sort of Article 5 type situation. Like if this is a kind of manifestation of hybrid warfare, when does it become open warfare? When there is this whole big grey area, given that there's so many different types of warfare you can do now: cyber warfare, information warfare, espionage and sabotage, and then outright conventional warfare. Like, when do you meet that criteria for triggering Article 5? We're no longer talking about agents of influence or some online activities, Siemoniak said. These are individuals who are ready to come and set things on fire. So literally setting that mall on fire. So Poland and Russia are not seeing eye to eye at the moment, and that is Russia's doing. Ukraine and Poland have today started official negotiations on the text of the bilateral agreement on security guarantees. This was stated by the Speaker of the Verkhovna Rada, so that's Ukrainian Parliament, Stefanchuk. The head of the Verkhovna Rada also added that during the meeting with the head of the Polish Senate in Kiev, they discussed all issues related to cooperation between the two states. Poland and Greece have urged the EU to create an air defence shield amid Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Authorities in Poland and Greece are obviously worried about Turkey, have called on the EU to create a special air defence shield for European countries. Quote, Europe will be safe as long as the skies above it are safe, Polish Prime Minister Tusk and Greek counterpart Mitsotakis said Thursday in a joint letter to the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. According to the authors of the initiative, such an air defence shield should be a project that responds to major vulnerabilities in European security. Tusk and Mitsotakis want to make their proposal at the next summit of the EU member states in June. It's very interesting as well because this is a step away from American dependence and NATO dependence. So this is, and some people have been saying this for a long time in terms of the EU needing its own army. A lot of British voters in the EU referendum in Brexit were sort of up in arms about, they want an EU army. No, we're dead against that. But actually, the reality is you've got a NATO army, you've got UN armed forces and peacekeeping forces that we contribute to. So there's no actual categorical difference. This is just another unit. And the thing is, when you have, and I know you can argue that the EU started as an economic, congregation of countries, but actually it is now clearly very much a political, economic group of countries. And as such, if you don't involve military strategizing within that, then you are missing out on a whole component of how you do politics. And so it seems, and this war I think has shown this, it seems eminently sensible that the EU should have a military strategy that is integrated within its political and economic framework and policy. So it is. That I think sounds fairly sensible to me, but you guys may differ in your opinions. So Ewan McDonald here says, no coincidence that China is now acting much more aggressively against Taiwan. The authoritarians saw from the example of Ukraine how weakly the democracies support one of their own when it's under attack. Weakness, lack of resolve and division encourage authoritarians' aggression. So 33 Chinese planes and 31 ships are approaching Taiwan, according to Agence France-Presse. Taiwan's military is preparing its air defense systems after large-scale Chinese exercises. And, of course, the exercises are very much a flexing, where they just push the envelope right next to the Taiwanese maritime borders and sometimes past them. Now, remaining on the topic of China, the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has said that she wants market-driven countries to present a, quote, wall of opposition to China. The official also said that she's looking for agreement from G7 to use earnings from $300 billion in Russian assets for Ukraine. Interesting. So we're going to move on to the US in a second. And I know that's always going to be a bit divisive because I'm going to be casting opinions on people like Trump and whatnot, but you can't get away from that. What's interesting about China is that at the moment, US has got one of the best functioning economies in the world. There's this really weird disconnect between perception and reality. So still, that I watched some really fascinating analyses of why this is. Nonetheless, there is a new poll has just come out that shows that people have a completely incorrect view of American economic situation at the moment. So there's a vast, I think it's a majority of people think that the US is in a recession, and they're like completely not in a recession. And so given that, and they think that inflation is much worse than it is, and they think that unemployment is really bad, even though it's the best it's been for they've got it just completely wrong. So people's perception of the economy in America is just nuts. They think that the Nasdaq is going a completely different direction to what it is. So you've got a really well functioning American economy that is hitting all these records and doing really, really well, and the stock market's doing really, really well. Unemployment's doing really well. Record low unemployment for all these demographics, etc., etc. And everyone's like, "Oh, the economy's terrible," and Biden's like, "Are you serious?" And of course, Trump and Biden are running for president in November 2024. Now, why this is all coming back to China is that one of the things Trump wants to do. So on the one hand, he's claiming that Biden, there's too much inflation, even though inflation is under control. It's not, there is still inflation, but it's a lot better than all the other countries worth considering. So Trump is going to be like, oh, inflation's bad, but he's also saying, and I'm going to deport 15 million people, and I'm going to put tariffs on every single bit of Chinese goods. So he's like, oh, yeah, inflation's bad, and I'm going to do some things that will absolutely hammer inflation. Like his actual policies that he's running on will be, in my opinion, economic suicide. Like to get rid of 15 million migrants that are there for the economy and to keep labor cheap, so therefore you have the cheaper social care or gardening or construction or whatever. And I'm not saying it's a good thing and illegal employment and whatnot, but the reality of the situation is that if you remove all those people, that will lead to inflation. And then if you put tariffs on every single Chinese good, which was not only just the goods themselves that you are consuming, but also the components that make the goods that you do manufacture in your country, you are going to absolutely destroy the economy in terms of like the amount of inflation that will trigger. So it's really interesting looking at inflation and China and the economy and the Chinese economy and the American economy. And yep, if you want to be a free marketeer, then that's not the way to go. But if you're fine on isolationism and protectionism, then by all means go for it. But if you like isolationism and protectionism, you have to know that it comes at a cost, at an actual tangible cost, like an economic cost. So by all means, get rid of illegal immigrants, and by all means, put tariffs on goods. But you have to understand that as long as you are prepared to pay for that, like it will cost you. And when I say you, I mean every single voter in the US, that will cost you. So yeah, anyway, moving on to American politics as it pertains to Ukraine. So this is a Democrat from Ohio, I guess appealing to Biden here.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to address a matter of profound importance, the implementation of the bipartisan and bicameral REPO Act. This legislation, signed into law on April 24th, grants the President the authority to seize Russian sovereign assets frozen in the United States and transfer them to Ukraine for its reconstruction. As co-chair and co-founder of the Ukraine Caucus, I cannot overstate the urgency of this action. Russia's illegal and unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine demands a decisive response from the international community. By swiftly implementing the REPO Act, we can provide crucial support to Ukraine. REPO proceeds will demonstrate our unwavering commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and efforts to rebuild once the war is over. And let me commend the administration's efforts to collaborate with our G7 and European allies in this endeavor. Together, we can establish an international compensation mechanism that leverages frozen Russian assets for Ukraine's benefit. The time to act is now. Let us show the world America's resolve and stand resolute with Ukraine against Putin's aggression and tyranny. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And I get absolutely 100% complete agreement there. I don't quite know. I presume she's appealing for Biden to get on and do this. Like we signed this. It's a bipartisan. Both parties agree with it, and it's bicameral. So we've got the Senate and House of Representatives. We've done this. It's law. Let's do it. Let's actually do it. So what are we doing with these frozen assets? We have the ability now to enact this law, to enforce it, to get things moving. And so hopefully that will happen. Interesting though, Russian President Putin has signed a decree yesterday authorizing the confiscation of assets of US citizens and companies to compensate for Russian assets confiscated by the US. Of course, this is going to happen. Now, there are a couple of things to note here. One, will that negatively affect the Russian economy in any way? in the short term, in like physically taking those assets under Russian control. Will it have any effect? Two, will it have a longer term effect on the Russian economy in terms of internal inward investment? So if people are worried about having stuff confiscated, like that won't be so bad for the US, because everyone knows that, well, it's Russia got their stuff confiscated, and I am Belgium, and I'm going to invest in the US, and I know that it's going to be pretty safe. However, so because we trust that America is A, democratic, and B, it's not Russia and dictatorial and morally bankrupt, right? But if I'm thinking about investing in Russia, I'm going to be thinking twice, thrice, more times. And so I think this kind of activity is not going to help Russia. Not that anyone was particularly, I think, imagining that investing in Russia is a great idea at the moment. But so there is that. And then the third element to consider is that on balance, who will this hurt more? Like, does the US have more presently, because they would have taken a lot of investment out and capital out of Russia since February 22. So will the confiscation of remaining American assets be more than the value of the confiscated Russian assets? Who loses out more here? And I would imagine that Russia are losing out more there. Now, I do worry a little bit about stuff like this. So all the things that have been happening for the last 8 years or so in America, and the idea that, stop the steal and the election, even though that was complete disinformation, the US is becoming a bit of an outlier here. So as other countries around the world, say the G7, are having greater and greater confidence in their national institutions from 2006 to now, the US is the one that's going backwards. So it's gone from a healthy confidence in its national institutions to an unhealthy lack of confidence in, and that means, by the way, the military, judicial system, national government, and honesty of elections. That is really worrying, especially since the 2020 elections were, despite what Trump will have you think, they were the most secure elections they've had. The problem comes in the information space, not in the actual electoral process. I would say gerrymandering is a huge problem, and I think the electoral college needs reform. I think those are long-standing issues in the US electoral system. But in terms of threats that are more, I guess, current, they are around the manipulation of people's beliefs and what they think is a fact or not fact, their knowledge. And that's where I'd worry. It's not the system itself, but it's the people in the country that are being manipulated by outside forces. Now, Trump said on Truth Social, he's making it clear that Putin, says Jay in Kiev, needs to continue kidnapping Americans to later trade them to Trump for allowing Russia to do whatever they want to 40 million Ukrainians. Ouch. So what's this in response to? Donald Trump said on Truth Social, Evan Gershkovich, who's a Wall Street Journal reporter who is basically incarcerated in Russia at the moment, from the Wall Street Journal, who is being held in Russia, will be released almost immediately after the election, says Trump, but definitely before I assume office. So in other words, between November and January, Gershkovich will be released. He will be caps home, caps safe, caps and with his family. Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, will do that for me, but not for anyone else. And we will be paying nothing, all caps. So this is Trump saying, I am on such good terms with Putin, or I have such control over Putin, that as soon as I am elected in, Gershkovich will be released. The problem I have with stuff like this is it's just nonsense. Like, it's a mere assertion. In the philosophical world, if you had someone saying something like this, you'd be like, you just dismiss it. That which is asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. It's Hitchens' razor. You don't just, like, the moon is made of cheese. I am going to fly you to Jupiter tomorrow on the back of a winged unicorn. Brilliant. Okay. Well done for saying that. Has absolutely no purchase on me because it's a mere assertion. And the chance of that actually happening appear to be incredibly slim unless you give me some really good evidence that will happen. Some good rationale for that claim. And there was no rationale here. There is just, Putin really likes me. We'll get it done. just, yeah. And as Trevor Reed said, who was, as a former wrongful detainee in Russia, I would just like to remind everyone that President Trump had the ability to get myself and Paul Whelan out of Russia for years and chose not to. I would be skeptical of any claims about getting Evan Gershkovich back in a day. I mean, there you go. There's someone who's been there, done that, and got the T-shirt. He was there while Trump was in charge, and Trump didn't succeed in doing anything. Now, if you're talking about how friendly he is with Putin, just listen to this at his recent Bronx rally.
When you see President Xi of China, when you see Kim Jong-un of North Korea, when you see Putin, and you see all of these people, they're at the top of their game, whether you like it or not, and they can't believe that this has happened to the United States.
He's slagging off the United States and saying these guys are at the top of the game, whether you like it or not. Like, he's in, like, I wouldn't sit there and go, yeah, Putin's at the top of his game, as in a way that's like, I approve of that and I appreciate that. I'm giving them reverence for being that. It's not like saying, oh, Hitler was at the top of his game, but, you know, as a vicious thug, a vicious, you know, totalitarian leader who was blah, 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 blah. You know, you could say that in a way that's like, I would never have done that myself. That is not like, it is horrific, but given what he was wanting to achieve, he was at the top of his game in that respect, in that way. Like, you could talk in those terms, but with the knowledge that you disagree with the kind of positioning of whoever you're talking about. But here it's very clear to me that there is an element of reverence in what Trump is saying about these people. And we've heard this before. We've heard him give love to Putin, to Xi Jinping, to Kim Jong-un, to Jair Bolsonaro, to Viktor Orban. He loves strong men. He loves dictators. And here it seems perfectly obvious to me
when you see President Xi of China, when you see Kim Jong-un of North Korea, when you see Putin, and you see all of these people, they're at the top of their game, whether you like it or not, and they can't believe that this has happened to the United States.
Why didn't he talk about leaders of democratic nations? Why didn't he talk about the leader of Australia, the leader of France, the leader of Germany, the leader of Sweden, leader of, I don't know, even India, Canada, UK? They're at the top of their game, blah, 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 blah. No, he chooses dictators. They're at the top of the game because that's who he wants to be. Absolutely incredible. Now, big news that people are like, why haven't you commented on this? And actually, I've just completely forgot to yesterday. So Nikki Haley was the main opposition to Trump in terms of the GOP nominee for, or running to be, the Republican candidate or nominee. The difference between nominee and candidate? Anyway, for US president in the elections in November 2024, and she ran a campaign that increasingly went against Trump, and she said an awful lot of things against Trump, and then she dropped out. Then lots of people were backing her still in these primaries that are just kind of almost academic. She was getting 20% of the vote, which are anti-Trump Republican votes, especially with some of these closed primaries that didn't have people that could be outside the Republican Party voting. She was still getting like 21% of the vote and whatnot. So, like, she represents this movement in the Republican Party. Is like, no, we don't rate Trump. He is divisive and he's not going to be good for the US. And she was saying that herself. And then she dropped out and people were wondering, is she going to endorse Trump? Surely she's not going to endorse Trump. And then lo and behold, she endorsed Trump.
Here's some of Nikki Haley's toughest criticism of Donald Trump over the last year.
He is not the same person he was in 2016. He is unhinged. He is more diminished than he was. If you don't know the value of our men and women in uniform, if you don't know the sacrifice that they go through, why should I, as a military spouse and all our military families, trust you to know you're going to keep them out of harm's way? And it's a pattern of losing that everything he touches he loses. We saw it in 2018, we saw it in 2020, we saw it in 2022. How many more times do we have to go back to the same person and say, and then finally decide maybe he's the problem? Because I know he's the problem. Of course, many of the same politicians who now publicly embrace Trump privately dread him. They know what a disaster he's been and will continue to be for our party. They're just too afraid to say it out loud.
Ouch.
Well, I'm not afraid to say the hard truths out loud.
And what's that hard truth now, you may ask?
So I will be voting for Trump.
So that's happened. They actually give a pretty good analysis of what's going on there. And the reality is that like, either she was lying then and she's just an outright liar, or she's lying now. And the reality is she's lying now, as in she endorses Trump, but she's doing that for her own political future, really. Like, she needs to, if she wants to run for president next time, she needs to run from within the Republican party. And there are some people that are talking about how there are two Republican parties. There's the old school kind of Reaganism, and there's the new kind of Trump, MAGA Trump, etc., etc. Now, other people saying that's just a complete myth. There is just a Republican Party, and Trump owns it, and he owns it big time now. And if she wants to operate in 4 years' time, if she wants to run for president, then she needs to think about connections and how to do that. And the reality is that she's not going, like Liz Cheney will not be in a position to run in 4 years' time. She's burnt those bridges, and I'd say she's got a lot more integrity and moral standing for doing so. I read Oath and Honor. I don't agree with any of Liz Cheney's political positioning, but her book is an absolute must read. It's a really very good book, and it's freaking scary. And if you, and I know I do have viewers out there who still really like Trump. I know I do, because I interact with you on the threads. I don't understand how you can do that, especially if you read a book like that and realise how anti-freaking democratic that man is. It's an absolute disgrace. So I am completely unapologetic here. I think Trump is a bad human being, and he is very bad for democracy. And a second Trump tenure will present all sorts of problems, predominantly with the Supreme Court. That he's already stacked. There's a 6-3 Conservative Liberal majority, and he'll probably get another 2 in. They'll be young, and you're looking, depending on who they replace, you're looking at like a generation plus of a Supreme Court that effectively, legally rules the land, that is skewed massively. You look at what Samuel Alito, who should be recused from the immunity case. I'm digressing anyway. It's a real problem, but that's a real worry if you're going to vote for Trump. But just on international diplomacy, the guy is just too ignorant and loves dictators, and appears not to like NATO, and appears not to like Europe very much. And goodness me, it's all really, really worrying. So anyway, Nikki Haley has gone into his camp. I don't expect to see her at rallies with him, though. It's interesting, Hakeem Jeffries, who is a Democrat House of Representatives minority leader, answered this question yesterday. He talked about Ukraine a couple of times in his press conference, but the question about using weapons, US weapons inside Russia, came up, and his answer was this.
It's my understanding that was a decision that was made on the floor. I wasn't there at the time, but the whole episode highlights the fundamental question that runs through the 118th Congress. Are we going to choose the Constitution or the cult? The Constitution or the cult? We believe that our job is to champion the Constitution, defend democracy, and eradicate extremism. Apparently, there are people on the other side of the aisle who want to try to silence Jim McGovern because he waxes the floor with them every time he speaks. Apparently, it makes them uncomfortable, and they just can't handle it, while at the same time giving Marjorie Taylor Greene free rein to conduct her outrageous behavior. This is what we're dealing with. Constitution or the code. So with respect to the Ukrainian war effort, I think that these are ongoing conversations between the Biden administration and the Ukrainian defense apparatus. I am of the view that we need to be as aggressively supportive as possible in ensuring that Ukraine can be successful in pushing back against Russian aggression for the good of the Ukrainian people, for the good of our allies in Europe, and for the good of the free world. In terms of the specifics, that is something to be worked out at the moment between the Ukrainian government and the Biden administration, which has done an incredible job to date in supporting our democratic allies in Ukraine who have fought bravely against all odds. And we cannot rest until victory has been won.
A couple of things though. So I really like how he talks about victory for a start, but he also seems to be personally agreement that Ukraine should be able to use, they should be supporting Ukraine as aggressively as possible, which I read as like, yeah, they should be able to use those weapons inside Russia. But it is up to the Biden administration and the Ukrainian military apparatus to sort that out. And that's trivially true, right? And I don't know that you could have answered any other way than that, which is, yeah, we should robustly support Ukraine. It's up to them to sort it out. But basically, I support that. That's how I read that. Now, there's been a lot of ink spilt about this. Some people think it's like, oh, typical freaking putting Hollywood celebrities over Ukrainian peace and whatever. This is a really difficult situation. And this is what happens when you have a diary that's sorted out as, say, the leader of the US, right? And everything is diaried going into the future. And then you have something popping up that's sorted out within Europe that doesn't go and look, oh, by the way, Biden, are you free? Because you're one of the main people we need to be there. And Biden's already committed. So he can't make the peace summit in Switzerland that has just been sorted out for, what is it, 15th, 16th of June. Oh, yeah, it says it there. And he's got a massive fundraiser. Now, this is a difficult one. I know that this is not going to go down well with a lot of people, but the reality is he needs to get himself re-elected. Like, that's super important, not just for him, but actually for Ukraine. So I'd argue that Ukraine is better supported if Biden is the next president, right? Rather than Trump, for all the reasons already given you before many times. And this is the biggest fundraising event, and that fundraising is going to be paying for these swing states to have offices in as many places as possible, and grassroots movements, etc., etc. They need money, and they are already out fundraising the Republicans, but they need to do that because they need to, for example, educate the electorate that actually the economy is doing very well. So for a start, that's a massive challenge. So he's like, well, do I not go to this and sacrifice some fundraising that could be the difference between us getting elected and not, if this election is going to be as close as people are saying it is? Or do I go to the summit in Switzerland? And some people are saying actually they should move the summit. I don't know. It's difficult. It's easy to slag off Biden for this, but at the end of the day, he already had that in the calendar. I don't know. But it's interesting that even I think Kamala Harris is not going to go either. So you're thinking it's probably going to be Antony Blinken. But though, to be honest, I think Antony Blinken's probably the better choice anyway, and probably realistically a better choice than Biden, really. I mean, Biden would be there as your figurehead, but I think Blinken is a person with the nous. So I'd argue he's more important anyway. But in terms of communicating the importance of Ukraine, obviously that's going to take a hit because Biden is saying it's more important I fundraise some money to get re-elected than and seen at the Swiss summit. So that is not going to go down well with a lot of people. US imposes travel restrictions on politicians undermining democracy in Georgia. Interesting. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken also said he is launching a review of US-Georgian relations. So they have done a bit of the carrot. I talked about this yesterday, and it seems like there's a bit of a stick. So there's a carrot and stick to try and make sure that there are several ways in which the Georgian politicians are being convinced that the foreign agents law is a bad idea and that they should be moving towards the West more convincingly. There's a lot of stuff there today. Sorry it took so long. I really appreciate your bearing with me on that one. Take care and I'll speak to you soon.